Welcome to the first episode in our series on the world's worst miscarriages of justice. Every time we're going to look at a different country, and today we're starting in my home country of New Zealand. This was a case born out of moral panic. It's the story of Peter Ellis, a man whose difference made him a target, a man who was convicted on hysteria and not evidence, a man who fought for justice, even in death, and won. So how did this childcare worker become the face of one of New Zealand's most controversial legal battles? Well, let's walk through that. To understand what happened to Peter Ellis, we need to step back in time to the early 1990s. Peter wasn't your average childcare worker. He was flamboyant, camp, a little bit eccentric, and kids absolutely loved him. His games, his imagination, his energy. But in a country where homosexuality had only just been decriminalised, not everyone saw his personality the same way. To some, he was cheeky and harmless. To others, he was suspicious, simply because he stood out. At the time, Christchurch, along with most of New Zealand, was swept up in a wave of moral panic. Rumours of secret child sex rings, supposedly involving politicians, judges, and even the police, were spreading fast. Fear was everywhere. It was a perfect storm. And Peter Ellis became its lightning rod. New Zealand, it seemed, was caught in the grip of a modern-day witch hunt. Ellis had worked at the Christchurch Civic Creche since 1986. By all accounts, he was trusted, respected, and dedicated to his job. But then in 1991, one of the parents of a 3-year-old child made an allegation of abuse. And in a city already primed by panic and fear, Peter Ellis could no longer be seen as that eccentric caregiver with a flair for fun. He became a symbol for something far more darker. He was cast as a villain and a monster. And what made him different made him the perfect scapegoat. And what followed was not an investigation led by facts, but by fear and speculation. In 1993, Peter Ellis was convicted on 16 counts of sexual abuse. He spent 10 years in prison, and it all began with one allegation from a mother in January 1992. The entire case turned on a series of interviews with preschoolers conducted behind closed doors, under pressure, and later questioned for their reliability. But here's the thing. At first, these children said nothing happened. But then suddenly the tone of the investigation shifted. Suddenly there were stories of trapdoors, cages, needles, even burning paper started to appear. These were impossible claims, yet they were treated as truth. Ellis faced 28 charges involving 13 children. And this is a moment that we all should take a pause, because the key figure leading all of this was Dr. Karen Ellis, a child psychiatrist brought in by the prosecution. But her role wasn't just to interpret evidence. She supervised interviews of the children, she advised the police, she met the parents, and she was even interviewed on TV. And then she testified as the Crown's main expert witness in court. Karen Ellis was everywhere. And when the same person is shaping the investigation and is also the star witness, you can see how the integrity of the process started to collapse. Years later, the Supreme Court acknowledged this entanglement as a contributing factor in Peter Ellis's wrongful conviction. Her overlapping responsibilities cast doubt on evidence and helped to expose one of New Zealand's most troubling legal failures. So what went terribly wrong here? Well, there were two big things. First, there was the illusion of scientific certainty. Experts suggested that common behaviours such as nightmares, anxiety, acting out were all signs of abuse. But those signs weren't proof of anything, and kids can have nightmares for many different reasons. Still, the jury were told these were red flags, as if they were hard evidence. This is mere speculation dressed up as science. Second, there's the contamination of evidence. Because panic spread through the community, parents started to compare notes, and they held public meetings. Not only that, the children were interviewed again and again in emotionally suggestive settings, and it's not surprising their stories grew more extreme as each interview was undertaken. Yet, in court, the risk of contamination was brushed aside by Dr. Ellis. Instead, every new disclosure was treated as credible. Even the most fantastical claims were considered as truth, so Peter Ellis was convicted on evidence that simply could not withstand scrutiny years later. So how exactly did the evidence end up getting so distorted, and who let that happen? As the words of the allegation spread and panic took hold, parents began comparing notes and organising meetings. What began as a single accusation quickly snowballed into a community-wide crisis. Children were interviewed repeatedly by different professionals in emotionally charged settings. But beneath it all, uncertainty lingered. Many New Zealanders were in disbelief, questioning whether the increasingly fantastical claims of trapdoors, cages, burning paper could truly be right. Doubts were expressed across New Zealand, and that deepened in 1992 when charges against Peter Ellis, co-accused, were dropped due to concerns about the reliability of the children's interview evidence. And yet when the case reached court, Dr. Karen Ellis, the key prosecution witness, downplayed the risk of contaminated evidence. She dismissed a core principle of child psychology that young children are highly suggestible and struggle to separate memory from influence. By rejecting this, Karen Ellis helped shape a narrative that treated every disclosure as credible. This resulted in a distortion of the evidentiary process, where contaminated testimony was presented to the jury as truth. The Peter Ellis case didn't just harm one man, it left lasting scars on the children and families swept into its wake. They were caught in a storm of hysteria that distorted memories, fractured trust, and left lasting emotional scars. Peter Ellis never admitted guilt. Even when he was offered parole, he refused because parole meant confessing the crimes he did not commit. That choice kept him in prison for longer, but it also showed his level of integrity and resolve. Peter was finally released in 2000 after serving 7 years in prison. But freedom wasn't closure for Peter. He spent the rest of his life fighting to clear his name. The Supreme Court was set to hear his case in 2019, but Peter died before that moment arrived. And in the eyes of the law, that should have been the end. But in a landmark decision, the court allowed his appeal to continue after he had died. What happened was that the court drew on Te Kana Māori, which recognises the importance of restoring mana, or dignity even after death. It was a landmark moment in New Zealand. Te Kana was confirmed as part of New Zealand's common law, even in cases involving a Pākehā or a non-Māori descendant. This landmark moment was legal history, and at last, humanity found its voice. Then in October 2022, the Supreme Court quashed his convictions. 30 years after the nightmare began, Peter Ellis was finally exonerated. This case is not just about one man, it's about what happens in a community when fear overrides reason, when experts blur the line between evidence and speculation, and when a system fails to protect the innocent. Jurors saw what they expected to see, and in the process, interpreting ambiguous behaviour as incriminating acts, simply because an allegation existed. That is just completely wrong and very dangerous because it undermines the presumption of innocence. Expert testimony in this trial carried a disproportionate weight, and in her testimony, Dr. Karen Ellis introduced a troubling circularity, arguing that red flag symptoms were more likely to indicate abuse simply because abuse had been alleged. That allegation became the lens through which the children's behaviour was judged, and this simply could never be held as evidence or proof of wrongdoing. To be fair, Dr. Ellis wasn't expected to know the legal boundaries of permissible opinion, but still she was allowed to cross these boundaries freely in court, making inferences about guilt, credibility and intent, not because she was qualified to do so, but because no one stopped her. And when experts speak with authority on matters outside of their scope in a courtroom, the court stops being a place of truth-seeking. It becomes a stage for persuasion and not legal arguments. Peter Ellis's name is finally cleared, but it took 3 decades, and it showed us something very sobering. If this can happen in Christchurch, New Zealand, it can happen anywhere. It can happen in your hometown. If this story moved you and you believe these lessons matter, help us to make sure they're heard elsewhere. Like, share and subscribe to support this series, because the more we talk about injustices, the harder it'll become to ignore them. For now, take care.